Hello my friends, my students, how are you? Here comes Alpaca Sensei. Are you still motivated? Today we will learn how to interpret the Japanese particles wa and ga when there are two clauses and two subjects. Are you ready? Good luck! We'll do a quick review on the clause. So a sentence can have clauses and send one message. For example, タクシーが来ましたから私は帰ります can send a message I'm going home by two clauses because the taxi came and I'm going home. And when there are two clauses, the subject situation is like this. Two clauses with one visible subject and two clauses with two visible subjects. I say visible because it can have an invisible subject when there is only one visible subject. There's a video on this topic, so watch that after this lesson. And what concerns today is the second one. So when there are two clauses and two subjects. So logically, we can have these four variations using wa and ga. And so what's the difference? To begin with, we need to think about three things. Firstly, the type of conjunction, and then the meaning of wa and ga, and then the given context. These three factors make the total nuance of the sentence. So, firstly, the type of conjunction. If the conjunction is that of reason or cause, the subject particle of the sentence attached to the conjunction must be ga. And so, we end up with these two sentences. 私が宿題をしないので先生は怒ります。私が宿題をしないので先生が怒ります。The basic meaning of this sentence is, since I don't do the assignment, my teacher is angry with me. But what is the difference? But wait, Mr. Alpaca, you said there are four variations at the beginning of the course, right? What happened to the sentences that have the particle wa and the same conjunction? Yes, you are right. Actually, the same conjunctions can have another meaning like the base or the reference. And if we use this conjunction for that meaning, that is, except for a reason and cause, we can use both wa and ga. And so, the basic meaning of these four sentences is, the fact that I'm not doing the assignment makes the teacher angry. So, a little review. So type 1, if the conjunction means reason or cause, we have to choose ga for the subject of the sentence. And type 2, if the conjunction has other meanings, we can choose wa or ga. And wa or ga is optional for the clause without conjunction. So if there is a conjunction node or etc., which means reason or cause, the clause takes the particle ga. And the clause without conjunction can take both. So in total, there are two variations. And when there is a conjunction that does not mean the reason or the cause, here this node means the base or reference, the clause can take wa or ga. And so, with the variations of the clause without conjunction, we end up with four sentences, and as a conclusion, in total there are 6 variations to pay attention to. So now the meanings of wa there's a video that covers it, so if you don't know in detail, watch it after this class. You can find the link in the description. But in short, the meanings of wa are theme, judgment, declaration, explanation, comparison, minimum, goal. And the meanings of ga are mandatory ga. So after the interrogative word as the subject and its answer. And then phenomenon, exclusivity, choice, responsibility of the subject. And now the given context. The given context is very important because it determines the type of the conjunction if there are several meanings, and the meaning of wa or ga, and the total nuance of the sentence. For example, if the type of conjunction is reason or cause, so ga is used, and the given context is like, the teacher asked me why he was angry with me, and the meaning of wa is call. The sentence 私が宿題をしないので先生は怒ります has the nuance like, Sir, you are angry with me because I am not doing the assignment. And another example, if the type of conjunction is reason or cause, so ga is used, and the given context is like, I was asked who was angry with me and why, and the meaning of ga is mandatory ga, so after the interrogative word as the subject and its answer. The sentence 私が宿題をしないので先生が怒ります has the nuance like, it's my teacher who is angry with me because I don't do the assignment. And from now on, if the type of conjunction is not the reason or the cause, and the given context is like, I was asked what will happen if I don't do the assignment while others do, and the meaning of first word is comparison, and the meaning of second word is judgment. The sentence 私は宿題をしないので先生は怒ります has the nuance like, I know others do their homework, but not me, so I'm sure our teacher will be angry with me. And another example, if the type of conjunction is not the reason or cause, and the given context is like, I was asked what was going on at school, and the meaning of wa is explanation, and the meaning of ga is phenomenon. The sentence 私は宿題をしないので先生が怒ります has the nuance like, in fact, I don't do the assignment and the teacher is mad at me. And another example, if the type of conjunction is not the reason or the cause, and the given context is like, I was asked why I didn't do the assignment, and the meaning of ga is exclusivity, and the meaning of wa is minimum. The sentence 私が宿題をしないので先生は怒ります has the nuance like, since I'm the one not doing the assignment, at least my teacher is mad for me. And the last example, if the type of conjunction is not the reason or cause, and the given context is like, I was asked why this teacher is angry with me, and the meaning of first ga is phenomenon, and the meaning of second ga is the responsibility of the subject. The sentence 私が宿題をしないので先生が怒ります has the nuance like, the fact that I don't do the assignment makes the teacher angry, who is in charge of me. Right, let's recap. So we've seen how to interpret a sentence made up two subjects and two clauses, and we've seen three factors. Firstly, the type of conjunction. So if the conjunction has a meaning of reason or cause, the clause with that conjunction must have ga as the subject particle. But if the conjunction has a meaning except reason or cause, we can choose both wa or ga. And don't forget that the clause without conjunction can also have wa or ga. And you have to pay attention to the given context because it determines the type of conjunction if there are several meanings, and the meaning of wa or ga, and the total nuance of the phrase. By the way, this rule of the conjunction and the choice of a particle between wa or ga for the subject is also used when it comes to the sentence with one subject and two clauses. So now it's your turn. How do you interpret these 6 sentences? Try with other conjunctions too. お疲れ様でした。If this course was useful, click like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done it. See you soon in a future video. Bye. さよなら。